Picture a genuinely simple test. Someone reads you a list of completely ordinary words, one at a time, and you say back the very first word that comes to your own mind. Table, chair, water, mother. For most words, the response is instant, almost entirely automatic, arriving before you'd even consciously call it a real decision at all. And then, on a word that looks and sounds exactly as ordinary as every other one on the list, you hesitate, just slightly, for no reason you can explain, your mind briefly stalling on something that should have taken less than a second to process. Carl Jung became fully convinced that this small hesitation was the single most important piece of data in the entire test, and it's how a young, unknown doctor built the reputation that eventually put him in the same room as Sigmund Freud himself. The test itself sounds almost too deceptively simple to matter, the kind of parlor exercise that seems better suited to a party game than to serious science. What Jung found hiding inside those small hesitations turned out to be considerably more useful than the test itself ever let on, and it changed the direction of his entire career before he'd even turned 30. This isn't simply a story about a lucky accident either. It took years of methodical, unglamorous data collection, hundreds of subjects and thousands of individual responses, recorded by hand and timed with a simple pocket stopwatch, before that single insight about hesitation crystallized into something Jung could actually publish and defend to a skeptical scientific community not yet ready to take his method seriously. In 1900, a 25-year-old Carl Jung joined the staff of the Burghölzli, the psychiatric hospital attached to the University of Zurich, as an assistant to its director, Eugen Bleuler, one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe at the time. Jung was, by most accounts, ambitious and largely unknown outside a small circle of Swiss psychiatry, working long hours in a field that still struggled for basic scientific credibility next to more established branches of medicine. At a hospital known for taking its research seriously, rather than treating psychiatric care as a purely custodial affair. By 1903, Jung had already begun collaborating with a colleague at the clinic, Franz Riklin, on a research method that had actually existed in a cruder form for decades before either of them touched it. Reading a list of common words aloud to a subject and recording, with a stopwatch, how quickly they responded with the first word that came to mind. Earlier researchers, including Francis Galton and Wilhelm Wundt, had already used versions of this test mainly to measure general mental speed and cognitive fitness, treating the reaction time itself as the primary object of study. Jung and Riklin took the same basic tool, one that had already circulated widely through European psychology for roughly 2 decades, without producing anything especially groundbreaking, and pointed it somewhere almost nobody had bothered to look before. If you're new to this channel, this is where we take one real teaching from one real thinker, and break down not just the idea, but how to actually use it. Subscribe if that's useful to you, because we do this every week. Bleuler himself, though better remembered today for coining the term schizophrenia during his own tenure at the same institution, ran a hospital culture that actively encouraged this kind of rigorous experimental research alongside direct patient care, an unusual combination for a psychiatric institution of that era, and one that gave Jung considerably more freedom and resources to pursue an unconventional line of inquiry than a young assistant might have found almost anywhere else in Europe at the time. Earlier, researchers using word association tests had focused almost entirely on the content of a person's response and how quickly it arrived, treating a fast, ordinary answer as evidence of a healthy, efficient mind. Jung and Riklin's genuine innovation was deciding to pay closer attention to exactly the opposite. Not the smooth, quick responses, but the disruptions. A hesitation on an unremarkable word. A repeated word used more than once without the subject noticing. A strange, illogical, or oddly specific answer to a word that should have produced something completely unremarkable. The kind of small stumble a casual observer would dismiss without a second thought. Where earlier researchers had treated these disruptions as noise, essentially test error to be smoothed over statistically and averaged away, Jung and Riklin began treating them as the actual signal worth investigating in their own right. Their working assumption, radical for the field at the time, was that a delay or a strange answer wasn't a flaw in the test. It was the unconscious mind briefly interrupting the smooth, automatic surface of ordinary thought, snagging on something the conscious mind hadn't fully registered yet, or had actively worked to keep out of view. Jung and Riklin didn't reach this conclusion after a handful of promising test sessions either. They ran the experiment repeatedly, on both psychiatric patients and ordinary hospital staff serving as control subjects, comparing patterns across dozens of individuals over an extended period before publishing anything, a level of methodical patience that distinguished their work from a lot of the looser, more speculative psychological writing circulating in Europe at the time. This reframing was, in itself, a significant methodological shift for the field. Rather than asking how fast and accurate is this person's mind, Jung and Riklin were effectively asking where, specifically, does this person's mind trip over itself, and why. That second question turned out to be considerably more clinically useful than the first, precisely because it pointed directly at material the person themselves usually couldn't access through ordinary self-reflection or direct questioning alone. Material that simply wasn't visible to any test measuring only speed and correctness. Jung gave a name to whatever it was that caused these disruptions. A complex, a cluster of emotionally charged memories, associations, and feelings, organized around a specific theme, sitting largely outside conscious awareness, but still powerful enough to interfere with something as simple as naming the first word that comes to mind. A patient who consistently hesitated, stumbled, or gave unusual responses to words clustered around, say, money or a parent or a specific relationship was, in Jung's reading, revealing the outline of a complex organized around exactly that theme, whether or not they had any conscious awareness of it themselves, and often to their own genuine surprise once the pattern was pointed out. Jung was careful to distinguish this discovery from simple guesswork or casual intuition about a patient's inner life. The complex, in his framework, was something concrete and measurable. A subject would show the same pattern of hesitation and disruption on the same cluster of related words across repeated test sessions, sometimes weeks apart, a consistency that ruled out simple chance or a bad day as the explanation. Jung and Riklin published their findings between 1904 and 1905 in a series of studies that quickly attracted attention well beyond Zurich's small psychiatric community, circulating among researchers in Germany, Austria, and eventually the United States. The word complex itself, now used casually in everyday language for almost any recurring emotional sensitivity, an inferiority complex, a savior complex, entered common use directly because of this research, a rare case of a piece of clinical terminology surviving intact in ordinary conversation more than a century later. The practical value of this discovery went beyond theory almost immediately. Swiss courts and police investigators, hearing about Jung's published results, began exploring whether a version of the association method could help identify guilty knowledge in criminal suspects during formal interrogations, reasoning that a person involved in a crime would show measurable hesitation on words connected to the details of that crime, details an innocent person would have no particular reason to react to at all. This forensic application never became a standard, widely adopted tool the way fingerprinting or blood typing eventually did, but it illustrates just how far the implications of Jung's original clinical observation traveled beyond the psychiatric ward where it started, from a stopwatch and a list of ordinary words to a courtroom. Among the people who took serious notice of Jung's published work was Sigmund Freud, already established in Vienna, who saw in the association experiments something his own psychoanalytic theory had been asserting on clinical grounds alone: hard, reproducible, statistical evidence that unconscious material could measurably disrupt ordinary conscious functioning in healthy non-psychiatric subjects, not only in patients already diagnosed with a mental illness. That shared interest became the opening that led to Freud and Jung's first meeting in 1907, a conversation reportedly lasting some 13 hours, and to the intense collaboration that would define, and later end, both of their careers within the following decade. While running the word association test on hundreds of ordinary healthy subjects rather than only psychiatric patients, Jung noticed something else, a second pattern layered underneath the one he was originally looking for. It wasn't only that certain words revealed a person's specific complexes. The overall style of a person's reactions, across the entire test, seemed to fall into one of two broad, consistent patterns, regardless of which specific words triggered a hesitation for that particular subject. Jung and Riklin described one type of subject as reacting with responses that were subjective and often emotionally charged, drawing heavily on personal feeling and private association, producing answers that said as much about the subject's inner state as about the word itself. The other type produced responses that were far more objective and impersonal, oriented toward external facts and observable qualities of the word itself rather than any private emotional resonance, answering almost like a dictionary rather than a diary. This wasn't a difference in intelligence, education, or mental health. It was a consistent, recognizable difference in orientation in where a person's attention habitually turned first, outward toward the object or inward toward their own internal reaction to it, a distinction that held up remarkably well across hundreds of subjects from very different backgrounds. Jung and Riklin didn't arrive at this second pattern quickly or casually. It emerged only after reviewing accumulated results across a large number of test sessions, comparing not individual answers but the overall texture of each subject's responses across dozens of words at a time, the kind of pattern that's essentially invisible when looking at any single reaction in isolation and only becomes visible once enough data has accumulated to compare across an entire test session and then again across many different subjects entirely, spanning months of careful, patient record-keeping. Jung spent the better part of the following decade refining this observation, and it's no coincidence that the same year, 1913, in which his framework crystallized into a clearer two-type model, was also the year of his break with Freud. Jung later suggested, though this remains debated among historians of psychology, that at least part of his disagreement with Freud and with Alfred Adler, another prominent figure in the psychoanalytic movement at the time, reflected exactly this kind of underlying difference in orientation: theories that emphasized outward, objective drives and social factors, versus theories that emphasized inward, subjective psychological experience, each man perhaps unconsciously building a theory that fit his own natural type more comfortably than the others. By 1921, Jung had expanded and formalized this two-type model into a full book, Psychological Types, introducing the terms extraversion and introversion into psychological vocabulary essentially as we still use them today, describing extraversion as attention oriented primarily toward the outer world of people, objects, and events, and introversion as attention oriented primarily toward a person's own inner world of thought, reflection, and imagination. He later added 4 functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, each of which could combine with either orientation, producing a considerably more detailed map of personality than the simple 2-category version most people know today, and one that took him years of additional clinical observation beyond the original word association data to fully articulate and defend in published form. It's worth noting how directly this typology grew out of hard, repeatable data rather than pure, theoretical speculation. Jung didn't sit in a study and imagine 2 categories of people based on personal intuition alone. He and Riklin had run the association test on hundreds of subjects, recorded the results systematically, and only then noticed the recurring statistical pattern that eventually became the foundation for one of the most widely recognized personality frameworks of the 20th century. That empirical starting point is easy to lose sight of once a theory becomes as culturally diffuse as introversion and extraversion have become, terms now used casually by people who have never read a single page of Jung's original clinical writing. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how much modern personality culture owes to this research, and also how much of what Jung actually argued gets lost by the time it reaches a BuzzFeed quiz or a 4-letter personality test result shared casually online. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, still one of the most widely used personality frameworks in corporate training and casual self-description, was built directly on Jung's typology, expanded by researchers who were not psychologists themselves, and who turned his flexible, spectrum-based framework into a fixed set of 16 discrete boxes people are sorted into, often after answering a questionnaire that takes less time than the coffee break, during which it's usually completed. Jung himself was explicit, in his own writing, that pure types were rare in practice, and that most people showed a dominant tendency toward one orientation while still using the other regularly, depending on context, mood, and life stage. He treated the categories as a map for understanding tendencies, not a permanent identity a person gets assigned once and carries unchanged for the rest of their life. Reducing his framework to a fixed 4-letter label you take once and treat as a complete explanation of your entire personality is closer to horoscope culture than to the careful, statistically grounded observation that originally produced the theory, built on hundreds of hours of actual clinical data rather than a single self-report questionnaire. The commercial success of simplified type frameworks says something worth sitting with about why Jung's original, more careful version rarely gets discussed with the same enthusiasm today. A fixed label is simply easier to sell, share, and build an identity around, than an ongoing process of noticing your own tendencies and their genuine limits. A 16-box quiz result fits neatly into a dating profile bio or a team-building workshop slide in a way that you show a moderate tendency toward introverted thinking, context-dependent, never quite will, even though the second, more qualified statement is considerably closer to what the original research actually supported and defended. So how would you actually notice your own orientation using something closer to Jung's original method than a modern online quiz? One practical version involves paying attention to where your energy goes after a demanding social event or a long stretch of external activity. Toward wanting more of the same, more people, more stimulation, more engagement with the outside world, or toward wanting quiet, solitude, and time to process internally before you're ready for more input, a distinction Jung considered far more reliable than simply asking someone whether they enjoy parties. A second, closer echo of Jung's original test involves noticing your own hesitations, not on formal vocabulary tests, but in ordinary conversation. Which topics make you pause slightly longer than expected before answering? Which questions you find yourself deflecting with a joke or a quick change of subject, rather than a direct response? Jung's own method suggests that those small hesitations are rarely random. They tend to cluster around exactly the areas of life carrying the most unexamined emotional weight for you specifically, the modern equivalent of the complexes his original patients revealed one ordinary word at a time over a century ago in a small clinical office in Zurich. A third, less obvious signal involves paying attention to which kinds of questions you find yourself answering with unusual precision and detail, almost eagerly, compared to which kinds you tend to answer in vague, general terms even when you clearly know more specific information available to share. Jung's original data suggested that people gravitate toward elaboration in exactly the areas that feel emotionally safe for them, and toward vagueness in exactly the areas that don't, a pattern that holds up remarkably well in ordinary conversation once you start listening for it deliberately rather than simply following the natural flow of the discussion. Jung was careful to note that neither orientation is inherently better or healthier than the other, a point that gets lost easily in a culture that often quietly treats extroversion as the more socially desirable default, rewarded in job interviews, school settings, and social gatherings alike. An introvert forcing themselves into constant extroverted performance, and an extrovert forcing themselves into constant introverted isolation both run into the same underlying problem: exhaustion from operating against their natural orientation for too long without adequate recovery time in the mode that actually restores them, a mismatch that can build for years before a person consciously identifies its source. The more clinically useful application, in Jung's own framework, wasn't simply identifying your dominant orientation and optimizing your entire life around it exclusively. It was recognizing that your less developed orientation, the one you use less naturally, still needs some deliberate space and attention, precisely because a completely one-sided psychological life, in his broader theory of individuation, tends to produce exactly the kind of unconscious pressure that eventually forces its way out in less controlled, less useful forms, echoing the same basic mechanism he'd already observed decades earlier in his original word association data. Jung also observed that a person's dominant orientation could shift somewhat across major life stages, particularly around the transition into midlife, a theme this channel has covered before in relation to his broader theory of individuation and the stages of a well-lived life. A younger extrovert, having spent decades building outward success, career, social status, a wide circle of relationships, might find themselves drawn increasingly inward during their 40s or 50s, not because their fundamental type had reversed, but because the neglected inner half of their psychology was finally demanding some of the attention it had been denied for years. Ignoring that shift, in Jung's clinical experience, was a common contributor to exactly the kind of midlife disorientation many of his patients brought to him without being able to name its actual source, mistaking a natural developmental transition for a personal failure or a sign that something had gone seriously wrong. You don't need a clinical setting or a trained analyst to borrow a simplified version of Jung's original method. Sit with a short list of emotionally loaded but ordinary words: family, money, failure, home, and simply notice, honestly, which ones produce an instant, easy response and which ones produce even a half second of hesitation or a slightly evasive answer, keeping a written record rather than trusting your memory of the exercise alone. The value isn't in diagnosing yourself with a formal complex the way Jung's original psychiatric patients were diagnosed, which required a trained clinician interpreting the full pattern of results rather than a single self-administered exercise. It's in noticing, with the same patient curiosity Jung brought to his original data, which ordinary-looking areas of your own life carry more unexamined weight than you'd assumed, information that a direct question, "What's bothering you?" often fails to surface nearly as reliably as an indirect, almost accidental hesitation does, precisely because a direct question gives a conscious, defended mind time to prepare an acceptable answer in advance. A useful refinement, borrowed loosely from how Jung and Riklin analyzed their original data, is to revisit the same list after a few weeks and compare your results carefully, watching for words that consistently produce hesitation across multiple separate attempts versus words that only tripped you up once, likely for reasons entirely unrelated to any deeper underlying pattern. Consistency across repeated attempts was exactly what separated a genuine complex from a random, one-off distraction in Jung's original clinical work, and the same distinction holds up just as well for anyone trying this simplified version on their own, without a laboratory or a trained analyst reading the results afterward. Jung built his entire early reputation, the reputation that eventually brought him into direct contact with Freud and shaped the rest of his career, on paying closer attention to hesitation than to the answer itself, a small methodological choice that ended up mattering far more than anyone in the field expected at the time. Almost everyone else running the same basic test before him had been looking at the wrong half of the data, measuring speed and content while treating the delays as noise to be filtered out, rather than as the most informative part of the entire experiment, a methodological blind spot that had persisted for roughly 2 decades before Jung and Riklin finally turned their attention toward it. The same principle holds up well outside a clinical laboratory. The topics you answer instantly rarely tell you much you didn't already know. The ones where you catch yourself hesitating, deflecting, or reaching for a slightly too quick joke are usually where the actual information is, sitting exactly where Jung's own century-old method predicted it would be, hiding in plain sight inside an otherwise unremarkable moment. If this kind of breakdown of real ideas from real thinkers is useful to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're doing this every week. Tell us in the comments, is there a word or topic that still makes you hesitate, even when you can't quite explain why?